coming today. My name is Penny Wright. We're happy to have one of our frequent guests whom we can always count on to produce a book a year, Tom Clavin. Before I introduce Tom, I just want to mention something, a bit of a housekeeping issue here at the library, something coming soon, and Yvette has made a cute little flyer. Many of you call to reserve for programs here, and starting in January, when you call?
December 11th.
Coming sooner than we thought, December. So this is something you want to get used to. You're going to have to leave your barcode on the message machine. Now, if you are a member of any library in Suffolk County, we'll take your barcode. You don't have to be a Southampton resident. If you don't have a library card, this would be your time to get a library card. And to get a library card, you need to bring a couple of bills with your name on them and go to the front desk, and it's easy to get a card. So this was not our idea, but it's happening, and so we're just going to go with the flow and hope you won't mind the inconvenience too much. A few words about Tom Clavin. Many of you know that he's a best-selling author, and he's worked as a newspaper editor, a magazine writer, a TV and radio commentator, and a reporter for the New York Times, who has covered entertainment, sports, and the environment. He has received awards from the Society of Professional Journalists, the Marine Heritage Foundation, and the National Newspaper Association. 4 of his previous books have been New York Times bestsellers, and they are The Heart of Everything That Is, Halsey's Typhoon, Dodge City, and The Last Stand of Fox Company. And I believe he's been here each and every time to talk about those books. And other recent titles that have received popular and critical acclaim include The DiMaggios, Last Man Out, Gil Hodges, Roger Maris, Lucky 666, and Reckless. His latest project, or his previous project, was Being Ted Williams, which was about the ball player, written by Hall of Fame broadcaster Dick Enberg, published this past May, this year in May, and this recent book, Valley Forge, which was written with Bob Drury, and it was just published in October. Coming up next spring, I am told, is a book that you'll be interested in, I'm sure, about Wild Bill Hickok, and that will be published, I think, in the next couple of months. And then he is collaborating with Phil Keith, who is here in our audience, who is an author and newspaper writer, Phil Keith, and he are writing a book, and I think it might be almost finished, called All Blood Runs Red, which is about the first American black fighter pilot. That should be interesting. So we're here to hear about Dodge City today. Please welcome Tom Clavin.
So we're going to fly from Dodge City right to Valley Forge.
I'm sorry.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks to Penny Wright and the people here in the Rogers Memorial Library. This is, I feel unusually relaxed giving a talk here. I think it's for a couple of reasons, aside from the Jim Beam I had for breakfast. One is that I haven't been here before, and it's always been a very pleasant experience to come here and talk to you folks, and so that's, not something I necessarily get nervous about to talk to people here. And the other reason is that this is my last appearance on the Valley Forge tour. Now, it's not much of a tour for me to come to Southampton, from where I live in Sag Harbor, but the tour for Valley Forge began October 1st. Now it's November 28th, and I've been, almost on the road. I've been on the road for almost all of that time, living out of a suitcase, and just getting back a few days ago from Atlanta, and doing different kinds of, from Boston to San Francisco to Miami to Denver and New York and all places in between. And the best part is giving the talks and interacting with people. The not so fun part after a while is the transportation and the hotels and literally getting to the point where I don't know where I am or what day it is. I mean, sometimes I've even had the experience sometimes waking up in the morning, and after a while every hotel room looks the same, and waking up and not knowing what day it is. And so I'll reach for the phone and call down to the front desk and say, what city is this? And they'll say, after a little hesitation, they'll say, oh, it's St. Louis. I said, okay, good, it must be Wednesday, because I know the schedule. But obviously a lot less complicated being here in Southampton. Over the weeks that I've been doing the talks that I've been giving has really evolved. It started out being more formal, and I'd be reading from the book. And then it just kept evolving to where I am today because of the Q&A parts of it. You know, people would ask questions, and it turns out that I would give some answers to questions, and people would be, you know, kind of surprised, because my talk originally would be the more surface level, almost like a, you know, your middle school social studies version of Valley Forge. And so what I thought about today is sort of like I'll cut to the chase, in that I put together, you know, from the talks that I've given and the questions that I've asked, what are the 7 most surprising things about Valley Forge? And you know, of course there'd be questions, you could ask questions if there's any follow-ups and things that I haven't covered, which there's a lot I'm not going to be able to cover. But you know, because most of us have this middle school textbook version of Valley Forge is recognizable. You say Valley Forge, most people say, okay, Revolutionary War. I remember that illustration in my social studies textbook. It's a few guys freezing in the snow, and there's George Washington on a horse watching a few guys freeze in the snow. That's Valley Forge. Nothing else happened except that for like 5-6 months. And there's so much more to it, one thing I got a lot of pushback on when I say this, the surprising thing, number one, is that Valley Forge was the most important battle of the Revolutionary War. Now, I'll get some pushback for 2 reasons. One, some people will say, wow, was it really more important than the Battle of Bunker Hill? Was it more important than Lexington and Concord? Was it more important than Saratoga? Was it more important than Yorktown when Cornwallis surrendered? And was it more important than when Washington crossed the Delaware and the Battle of Trenton? And so I'll say, yes, more important than that. And then some people will, the light bulb will go on. And then they'll say, well, wait a minute. There was no battle of Valley Forge. Valley Forge was not a battle. And so that's where I'll come back and I'll say, you know what? Valley Forge was the most important battle of the Civil War, because it was a battle of survival. If George Washington and the Continental Army had not won the Battle of Valley Forge, that battle of survival, the Revolutionary War would have ended in the spring of 1778. When George Washington and his army staggered into Valley Forge, it was December 19, 1777, he had 12,000 troops with him. There were about 400 other people. There were women and children who belonged to different members of the army. So he walked into Valley Forge, staggered in with 12,000 soldiers. And by the time that the Valley Forge encampment was over, the battle was over, 2,000 had died. 1 out of every 6 soldiers in the Continental Army died in Valley Forge. It was the highest death toll of all the suffered by the Americans of all the battles in the Revolutionary War combined. Was Valley Forge. And when I say battle of survival, I mean they had to survive, and the reason why they were dying. One was starvation. Some soldiers literally starved to death. Some of it was exposure to the elements, where they died literally froze to death. Others just got gradually weary. The frostbite piled up. There were all these physical, consequences of constant exposure. And the third big reason was disease. So there was those 3 things led to 1 out of every 6 soldiers dying. So you can see that the British strategy some of you may be aware of this now, but the British during Valley Forge were occupying Philadelphia. And that had been the capital of the United States. And the Americans had hoped it would remain the capital of the United States. But back in September of '77, thankfully, Alexander Hamilton was a lieutenant colonel on Washington's staff. He was on patrol, and he happened to see long lines of British redcoats heading to Philadelphia. He races in, he goes to the Continental Congress, which at the time was, the president was Patrick Henry, and he said, you know, guys, get out of here now, don't look back, just go, because otherwise you'll be captured. The British are, you know, on the outskirts of the city. You have to remember something, if they had been captured, they would not have been prisoners of war, Continental Congress. They would have been hung, because they were considered traitors. So it was a death sentence to be captured by the British. So they scattered, off they went. Some just went home, Massachusetts, Vermont, New York. Some went to York, Pennsylvania. So the British took Philadelphia, and during that winter, their strategy was, which was a smart strategy, is, you know what, we've got it great here in Philadelphia. We've got our taverns and saloons, we've got the restaurants, we've got plenty of food, we've got our American mistresses. Whatever we want, we have here in Philadelphia. We're nice and we're snug as bugs in a rug. We're just going to wait and let the American army disintegrate. And then, we'll, April or May, we'll march over there. Whatever's left, we'll mop them up. We'll kill who's left, capture the rest, we'll hang Washington from the nearest tree. Revolution over. That was really a pretty smart strategy. Why try and slog through the snow to fight battle where you don't have to? The elements and the disease is doing it for you. So, in that sense, Valley Forge was the most important battle of the Revolutionary War, because if there had not been a win, a defeat of all those elements, and if there had not been a Continental Army left, there really would have been no more revolution. It would have been over in the spring of 1778. The second thing I want to mention is that the Valley Forge had become the de facto capital of the United States during that 6-month encampment. And the reason why is, as I mentioned, the Continental Congress had scattered. It virtually ceased to exist. There was no functioning government anymore in the United States, basically. They couldn't collect taxes. They couldn't even, you know, agree on a sentence. There was nothing that was being effective that they were doing. And when Washington and his men staggered into Valley Forge, the first thing he ordered them to do was start getting whatever wood was available, cut down trees, whatever you had to do, and build huts to try and put some kind of shelter over the men. They ended up building about 2,000 huts, and suddenly, because of those 2,000 huts and the 12,000 men and their 400 or so women and children camp followers, suddenly Valley Forge was the 7th largest city in the United States. Overnight, basically, sprang up. And the government, by default, was Washington and his staff. George Washington was the only functioning, wherever Washington was, that was the center of the government. And his staff, and they were the ones only generating orders and trying to keep the government going and letting people know what was going on, what they needed, where the troop movements were going. So that's another surprising thing about Valley Forge. It became the capital of the United States, taking over Philadelphia during that 6-month period. Make sure I don't leave something out. With George Washington as the leader of the government, because he was the only one, I mean, the only thing that was still functioning, even though it was barely, was the Continental Army. He was the commander-in-chief. So wherever Washington was, that was the government. The third surprising thing, given that, the third surprising thing about Valley Forge is that it was during the Valley Forge encampment that was the strongest effort to fire George Washington. They wanted to get rid of him. There was an actual conspiracy against George Washington. A bunch of some disenfranchised delegates, some other army officers were conspiring together to have Washington replaced. You know, usurped, a coup d'etat, whatever you want to call it. Now, part of it was because of ambition, greed, jealousy. Horatio Gates was probably the worst conspirator. He had a little bit of credit to his name. He had been the captain of the general of the army when that defeated the British at Saratoga, General John Burgoyne's surrender. Even though he had never left his tent during the entire battle. The field general that won that battle was Benedict Arnold. But Gates was at the top of the masthead, so he gets the credit. And he took this credit down to, York, Pennsylvania, and said, I should be, this British-born General Gates, I should be the head of the army that's fighting the British. Doesn't make much sense, but that's what he thought. And also, they pointed out that Washington had not had a victory in quite a while. During the fall campaign in '77, they had lost the Battle of Brandywine. They had lost the Battle of Germantown. There was the Paoli Massacre. Anything that ends in massacre is not something that worked out well. So it's one defeat after another. And they said Washington has not had a victory really since the crossing the Delaware the year before. And that was not really a battle, it was a raid. It really only involved a few hundred troops. It wasn't a battle. So Washington had to do the best he could to keep his position as commander-in-chief, even though there was a time he was a little ambivalent about it. I mean, this is a man who's trying to keep his army together. At the worst of it, January and February, men are dying by the dozens per day. And he's, Washington's trying to not give in to despair, because he knows that if he shows weakness, if he shows that he's close to giving up, the rest of the army's just going to leave. They're just going to get up and walk away. And there is at one point, though, he writes a letter to a friend and he says, if they really think this is such a good job, they can have it. What's the worst that can happen? I'll go to Mount Vernon and spend the rest of the war there with my wife and my adopted children and my farm and my animals. I think one of the reasons that I really got interested in doing this book is to sort of, I don't know if restore is the right word, but I want to remind people what a remarkable man George Washington was. I think he's been a little bit lost. Lincoln's gotten a lot of press, and Teddy Roosevelt, and some of the other presidents, and we sort of forget that George Washington was there at the beginning and how important he was as the commander-in-chief. And we know now if he had been replaced, it would have been totally disastrous. But let's just put one thing in perspective. When Washington became the commander-in-chief, it was in 1775. When Washington finally said goodbye to his senior officers at the Fraunces Tavern in New York, that was in November of 1783. Washington was commander-in-chief. He was in the field with his army for 8 years. He didn't phone this in from someplace else. He did not take months off at a time and say, okay, Army, good luck, I'll see you in May. He was with them 24/7, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year for 8 years. He gave up everything. Gave up his family, gave up his home. He gave up all the comforts that he could have had. And he stayed with his army. So I think, looking back on it, there really was no other human being who at that time could have held the Continental Army together. And yet it's so surprising. What were they trying to do at the time? Get rid of him. He barely held on to his job, and then he managed to vanquish his political foes. Let me just get to my other note here. So I was like, whoever's counting, I think that was 3 things. Oh, this is one of my favorite parts of the book. Washington at Valley Forge was surrounded by, he had 3 surrogate sons. And Washington, some of you know this, he did not have children of his own. When he married Martha, who was a widow, he adopted her 2 children. But he did not have children of his own. And here he was in his 40s at Valley Forge, and he had these 3 very young men who surrounded him, who adored him, who were taking a bullet for him in a moment, that each brought a little something to the table to help sustain him during the Valley Forge encampment when things were looking their worst. The first one was the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, Lafayette was sort of like the emotional connection for Washington. Lafayette was pure emotion in a lot of ways. When he was 19, he snuck out of France. He sailed across the Atlantic, showed up in America, made his way to Washington, presented himself and said, here I am, I will do whatever you want. I believe in the cause of liberty. Now that I meet you, I am just so in awe of you. Do with me what you will. Now, Washington couldn't help but being kind of pleased by this for 2 reasons. One, there was this puppy dog devotion that this French nobleman was suddenly showing up and giving to him. The other reason is, for the very few times in his life, Washington could have a conversation with somebody and look him in the eye. What I say by that is Washington was 6'4", okay? Everybody at that time, the average height for an American male was probably 5'5". Washington was always, as well as psychologically, Washington was always physically the tallest man in the room. Lafayette was 6'3". So finally, you know, they're having this conversation. These two guys that immediately formed this paternal father-son relationship, which lasted for the rest of their lives. During the Battle of Brandywine, I mean, by the time Lafayette was 20, he was a major general and commanding a division of the Continental Army. And during the Battle of Brandywine, Washington got word, came back with word, got back to him that Lafayette had been shot out of his saddle and he was wounded. And so Washington grabs the nearest surgeon and sends him to the front. He says, "Treat him as if he were my son," is what he told him. That's the way they began to feel about each other. And again, it lasted for the rest of their lives. When Lafayette finally had his one and only son, he was named George Washington Lafayette. It was like he was George Washington's grandson. The second one of this trio of surrogate sons was Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton at that time was only 22. He was Washington's intellectual son, intellectual connection. He was the right-hand person for Washington. He wrote most of Washington's letters. Like when you look up Washington's, which you can find, everything's digitized on the Library of Congress. If you were to look up letters and general orders and memos Washington wrote during that period, the majority of them are in Alexander Hamilton's handwriting. He had excellent penmanship. And he could finish Washington's sentences. Washington could just say something about this letter or memo we wanted to write, and Hamilton knew immediately what to write. It had this really symbiotic mental connection. And again, he was only 22 years old. And Hamilton, he wanted very much to have a battlefield command, but Washington was too indispensable. Washington couldn't let him go. The third one, who was sort of like Washington's spiritual connection or spiritual son, I don't mean that religiously so much as he was so fervent about the cause of liberty and the cause of independence, was a man named John Lawrence. And John Lawrence is the founding father we never knew. And maybe at the end somebody will ask a question, why? But for now, Lawrence was also 22 years old. He was from South Carolina. And he became Alexander Hamilton's best friend. They were almost inseparable during the Valley Forge encampment. And he was such a huge supporter of Washington. When his father, Henry Lawrence, became president of what was left of the Continental Congress, John kept writing letters, back-channel letters, especially during the conspiracy, saying, "We must support this man. George Washington is indispensable. There's no army, there's no revolution without him." And every so often when Washington would feel a little bit of despair about the way the revolution was going, all he had to do was have a conversation with Lawrence, who would just buck him up, and say, "This is what we're fighting for. This is the cause of liberty. This is independence. We're going to kick those British right out." And so between the three of them, the relationship they had makes up a pretty sizable part of the book, because that was so important to Washington in keeping his head above water, to have these very, very young men who would become, important to him for the rest of his life. Lafayette, certainly, the way he helped persuade France to come in on the American side. Hamilton became part of Washington's government, Secretary of the Treasury, created the financial system, et cetera, et cetera. This part I found very interesting. The Continental Army, the surprise, it was an integrated army. And it would be the last time that the American Army would be integrated into the Korean War. Now you might think, well, wait a minute, there were black units in World War II, World War I, Civil War. But those were segregated units. For example, you see the movie Glory, some of you, with Matthew Broderick playing the white commander of the unit of black soldiers. That was a segregated unit that was commanded by the white captain or major, whatever it was. And that would be the case all through until the Korean War, when black and white soldiers fought, slept, ate everything side by side. That's what the Continental Army did. Of the 12,000 soldiers that went into Valley Forge, 750 were black. Very sizable amount of the army were black soldiers. In fact, the very first soldier to die at Valley Forge was a Connecticut soldier named Jethro on Christmas Eve. So I find that very, very surprising, because it was an immigrant army in the sense too, where you had you had guys from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Eastern Europe, One of the characters of the book is Casimir Pulaski, who was the one who created the American cavalry. Was created there. You have the French Louis Duportal, who was the one who was in charge of putting up the breastworks and the defenses of Valley Forge. The work he did there and the unit he started to do there was the origin of the Army Corps of Engineers. So all these things sort of came out of Valley Forge. There's a lot going on, and it's more than just a bunch of guys, well, we got to freeze for another 2 months, then we can get up and get out of this picture, you know. Now for the sixth surprise, I'm going to cheat, because I can. I'm going to sort of like squeeze two things together. And with the first one, people usually think that I've lost my mind, gone off the rails, which is probably true, but not specifically in this case. Valley Forge saw the beginning of the U.S. Submarine warfare program. You're probably thinking, what? 1778? It is true. Has anybody ever heard of the turtle? Some of you have. A man named David Bushnell, a Connecticut engineer, approached Washington during the Valley Forge period and said, I have invented a device called a submarine and a weapon called a torpedo. And I propose to put this submarine in the harbor at Philadelphia. It's going to sail underwater. Sail probably isn't the right word, but it's going to go underwater to Admiral Howe's flagship. It's going to attach the torpedo to it and blow it up. And we're going to show that we can have this amazing device and weapon to fight the British. So Washington is sort of like, you know, well, if you say so. You know, what do you have to lose, really? So the Turtle was a one-man submersible vehicle that was piloted, I guess you could say, by a man named Sergeant King. They recruited this guy, Sergeant King. And he would push these levers that would propel it underwater. So under the cover of darkness, they put it underwater, and it went under the water, and that night, in January of 1778, got all the way to Admiral Howe's flagship. And the idea was he had this screw-type thing that could make a hole in the hull of the ship and stick the torpedo in it, and then back away, and the thing would blow up. Nobody knew until too late that Admiral Howe's warship had copper under the waterline. So he couldn't drill the thing through. He sort of managed to stick the torpedo up against it somehow anyway. I don't know, spit on it or something and stuck it up there. By this time, so many hours had gone by, the sun was coming up, and as he's backing away from the ship, the sailors are looking over the side of their ships, the British sailors, saying, what the heck is that? I don't know, let's shoot it. So they start shooting at the poor turtle, as this guy's frantically, you know, propelling himself back across the water. He did end up escaping. Torpedo did not go off. But to Washington and to other subsequent commanders, it showed the concept could work. You could put a ship underwater, move it underwater to an enemy ship, and possibly damage it at least, or even sink it in some way. So it really was the beginning of the U.S. submarine warfare program. Now, part two, since I'm squeezing two things together, and some of you have heard of this name, Baron von Steuben. Okay? Now, again, the textbook image of von Steuben has always been that he was this great German or Prussian general who decided that he loved the cause of liberty and was going to come over to the United States and, you know, totally redo the army. That was the image of Baron von Steuben. There's some truth to that. I mean, in reality, Baron Friedrich von Steuben was a con man and a spy who was out of work. He had never risen above the level of captain in the Prussian army and gotten kicked out. And one scandal after another had gotten him kicked out of other armies until he showed up in Paris broke in getting a job. And he went to see Benjamin Franklin, who was trying to negotiate a treaty with France. And Franklin said, but you can't train troops. Steuben said, well, I can do that. You know, I haven't done much else to be distinguished, but I can do that. Franklin said, perfect, we need that badly. Let me do a resume for you, basically. So by the time Franklin was done, Steuben was lieutenant general in the Prussian army and the right-hand man of Frederick the Great, and had they created all these, chest was full of medals. He shows up at Valley Forge in a horse-drawn wagon, you know, surrounded by Doberman pinschers, with a French cook who quit in 24 hours because there was nothing to cook. And medals galore, shows basically his resume to Washington, and Washington says, and by the way, I mentioned he was a spy, right? Well, the French hired him as a spy because the French are thinking, we got to find out how bad things are over there because we want to back the wrong horse. we don't want to declare war on Great Britain and put a lot of money into fighting this war if it turns out the Americans are like one step away from annihilation or starvation or just disappearing. So they gave von Steuben some money, say, you send us reports. Don't tell anybody you're doing this, but send us reports how bad things are. Yes, I'll do it. I'll do anything for money. So von Steuben is basically, Washington says, listen, my army is yours to command. Do what you can. We badly need training. These guys don't even understand attention. Start from there. So von Steuben starts going around to the troops and examining them and making notes. He's accompanied by Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence. Von Steuben can't speak English. And so he's making notes, and suddenly something happens. This transformation takes place. It's like von Steuben gets religion or whatever. He falls in love with the American army and adores George Washington. And he says, you know what, this is the first time in my life I care about something other than myself. I am going to train these people. I'm not going to spy for the French. I'm not going to take their money. I am going to be part of the American cause for liberty. And sure enough, he sets to work training these troops. He teaches them how to stand at attention. He teaches them how to get together in a marching formation, how to fix bayonets, the basics that most of the Continental Army soldiers did not have. He starts doing. Now, it takes a little while to get some traction with the training, because again, he doesn't speak English, and he's somebody who had a temper. He gets frustrated easily if somebody's not doing something. So he would have Hamilton with him, for example, and he would see the troops not doing something correctly. I mean, von Steuben would get down in the mud and the snow with them, you know, really train them from the bottom up. But if something frustrated him, he'd start cursing at them. But the closest he could get to was curse in German. So what he would do is that he would curse at them, and then he would pause. He would translate his curses into French. Then he would speak French to Hamilton, who would translate the curses into English and curse at the soldiers for von Steuben. Now the soldiers would crack up over this. They thought it was hysterical, but it endeared them to each other. And they started to listen to him, and week after week after week went on, all through March, all through April, and the Continental Army started to be a trained fighting group. And getting confidence too, because as the spring started to come along, you know, things started to get better. The disease, so food started to get through. Wasn't as much disease. You know the cliche, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That's what happened to the Continental Army. They started to feel like we've been through the worst. We feel stronger than before. Those of us who are left are the strongest of the strong. And now we know how to fire a gun. And we know how to use a bayonet. And we know how to attack. And we know how to withstand attacks. All these things that real soldiers do. The seventh thing about Valley Forge that is kind of surprising is George Washington as action figure. Now, many of us have this perception of George Washington as an older man. You know, the white hair, does he or does not have wooden false teeth. He's staring back at us from a dollar bill or from a portrait that's hanging on a museum wall. And we sort of overlook that George Washington was a soldier and a warrior. He had fought in the French and Indian War, escaped death several times. And as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, yes, he had to mostly stay behind while the action was taking place because he was the most valuable person in that army. He couldn't put himself at risk indiscriminately. But then we get to the end of the Valley Forge encampment, and there's a new commander-in-chief of the British, Sir Henry Clinton. And word comes through that Franklin has been successful, negotiated an alliance with France. France has come in on the war with the Americans. The British in Philadelphia suddenly realized, you know what? If one day we look out on the horizon and there's a French fleet appearing, they could blockade us, and we're stuck between a French fleet and a possibly reviving American army over here. We're caught in the middle. That could be bad news. So Clinton made a decision, let's leave Philadelphia, we're going to march up to New York, consolidate our forces so that we're twice as strong, and plan a really aggressive summer campaign. So the day comes in June 1778 that the British Army leaves Philadelphia, it's marching up to New Jersey. And Washington confers with his generals, his top senior generals, Henry Knox, Nathaniel Greene, Anthony Wayne, Lord Sterling, several others, John Sullivan. And they all decide, and Lafayette, and they decide, okay, this is the time to attack. And Washington chooses Lafayette to be at the head of the attack, launch the first attack. But then a critical mistake was made, one that Washington couldn't get himself out of, but there's another British-born general named Charles Lee, who was actually the senior officer next to Washington in the Continental Army. And Lee said, if somebody's going to have the honor of the attack, it should be me. Well, when Washington said, well, but you just told me yesterday you think it's a bad idea. I know I did. But I am the next senior guy, and it'd be embarrassing to put this 20-year-old ahead of me for the attack. Washington's, okay, attack the next morning, here's the game plan, okay. So the Sunday morning, it's just barely dawn, it's going to end up being a hot, hot day, like 100 degrees. And Lee starts the attack, and not surprisingly, the British, turn to face the attack, and then start to attack back. Lee panics. He says, oh my God, the British are actually attacking. We know we can't defeat the British. Let's get out of here while we can. And he starts racing towards the rear. Well, thousands of troops see him going and say, well, we better do the same. So they start running towards the rear. So you have this nightmare scenario playing out, where after all these months of Valley Forge, and the opportunity comes to use your training and actually meet the British in battle, and the British troops, you can see thousands of redcoats coming down the hill with their bayonets fixed. If they overrun the American army, if they annihilate it, if they capture it, if they capture Washington, kill Washington, the revolution is over. So Washington gets word, back at his headquarters that this is happening. And over, ignoring the pleas of his aides to stay back, he gets on his white charger, so he rode a white charger, and he races for the front. And he gets to the point where his soldiers are streaming to him. And he stands there. He's not going to move. He's not retreating. And he stands there and he starts imploring his soldiers. He said, will you fight with me? Don't stand here. Stand with me. Fight with me. Fight with me. He's pleading with them on his white charger. And one by one, two by two, dozens by dozens, they stop running. And they turn and they form lines on either side of him to face the British, who are again advancing with their redcoats. And the only part I want to read, and it contains my favorite sentence in the whole book. There's a phone in that white coat, in the breast pocket of that white coat.
Okay.
Yeah. Just click it or something. Just going to read this one part, and I'll signal when it gets to my favorite sentence. But what we're seeing here, which is kind of surprising about Washington that we don't normally think of, is George Washington as action figure. He is personally taking control, and it can't be emphasized enough. The physical risk he was in, because that complicated there.
Well, I don't know if it's complicated, but I can't do it. Sorry.
This is the second phone that Alexander Bell invented. That's how old this is. Okay. Did ignore it. Okay. Good. So here he's the commander-in-chief. He's dressed like the commander-in-chief. The British many British officers at least, knew what Washington looked like. He's on top of a white charger. There's cannonballs flying all over the place. There's bullets and musket fire all over the place. Any time, at any moment, a cannonball or a bullet could kill George Washington. Not only would have ended the battle, but probably ended the revolution if the greatest leader that you have suddenly dies on the field of battle. The rest of the army would have just collapsed. And with it, if it collapsed, the revolution collapses. But Washington would not listen to anybody who's saying, get out of harm's way. And he's rallying the troops. He's forming lines of defense. Let me just read this part here. For Lafayette, the transformation in his commander-in-chief was astonishing. Quote, his presence alone stopped the retreat, the Marquis recalled. His graceful bearing on horseback, his calm and deportment were all calculated to inspire the highest degree of enthusiasm. In short, Lafayette concluded, I thought then as now that I had never beheld so superb a man. Through the shank of the afternoon, Continental soldiers spotted Washington here shoring up a faltering line, and there leading reserves into gaps in his defenses. His courage under fire was inspiring, as he personally stationed a company of New Yorkers behind the defensive hedgerow, looking down on a trail the advancing British would have to traverse. And during propitious moments, he detached parties of light infantry into the teeth of the enemy advance. The impact made by the imposing Virginian's presence on the battlefield that day cannot be overstated. Okay, here's my favorite sentence. It is no exaggeration to state that wherever Washington made his stand on that bloody field, so stood the American Revolution. That's exactly what was going on at that particular moment. If he had retreated, if he had been killed, if anything had happened, the revolution was coming to an end. I don't think there's any doubt about that. At one point, while he was gathering dragoons to counter an enemy cavalry charge, A cannonball landed yards from his position, spooking his horse and throwing mud into his face. Washington never flinched. Hamilton, back at his commander-in-chief's side, could not help seeing it as a metaphor in the making. Citing Washington's, quote, coolness and firmness, he later recalled, "I never saw the general to so much advantage, directing the whole with the skill of a master workman." Not long afterward, as Washington galloped off to confer with Anthony Wayne, his steed staggered, slumped, and tumbled to the ground. It had died from heat exhaustion. Washington grabbed the reins of a chestnut mare, leaped into the saddle, and rode on. So, the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse was the longest battle of the Revolutionary War. It began just as the sun came up. It only ended when it got too dark for the soldiers to see each other to keep shooting. And so the British were on one side of that field, the Americans on the other. Everybody was exhausted. Like I said, some of the casualties that day was simply heat stroke and heat exhaustion. The Continental Army just basically fell where they fell is where they slept. And Washington and Lafayette and Nathaniel Greene put their cloaks on the ground and slept right next to each other with their men. The idea being, as soon as the sun comes up the next day, we're going to take it to the British. We're going to keep going, keep doing what we have been doing. What they were not aware of is Sir Henry Clinton had decided with his generals, Cornwallis and some others, that we can't beat these guys. That's a different army than the ones we've been facing for the last couple of 2-3 years. We better get out of here while we can. So under cover of darkness, they snuck out and made their way back to New York. So when Washington and the others got up the next morning, they could have caught them if he had a fresh army. But you had guys that, again, were so exhausted, had eaten or barely slept, so he didn't think he could catch them before they got to New York. So the Battle of Monmouth was really the big turning point battle. It was the last battle in the Middle Atlantic states until Yorktown 3 years later, where Cornwallis surrendered and effectively ended the war. Washington, I think one of the things to mention about why Valley Forge is so special is it was, for the rest of his life, a special place, almost like a sacred place for George Washington. He was not one to revisit battlegrounds, battlefields from his past. He didn't make a special trip for the Battle of Long Island or go up to Brandywine or Bunker Hill, places like that. He went to Valley Forge twice. Now the first time was sort of like an expedition. He was, at that time, 1787, he was sort of like the reluctant president of the Constitutional Congress. He wanted to help what he could do to help the Constitution, but be formed. But he wanted to stay in Mount Vernon. I've done my bit, he basically said, which he had. He fought in 2 wars. And he and a couple of others were going for a fishing expedition in Valley Forge and in Pennsylvania, and found themselves near Valley Forge. And they visited for a little bit, and then left. But the second time, I think, was most telling, and it was in 1796. Washington was in the final months of his second administration. He was going to be able to step down as president and finally go home to Mount Vernon for good. And one day, in 1796, he got on a horse, and by himself, he rode out of Philadelphia and rode to Valley Forge. There's no Secret Service, no escort, no Ford Escalades, or anything like that, just him on a horse. And he rode the 20 miles or so to Valley Forge, and he got there, he got off his horse, he walked around. Most of the encampment by that time had been returned as to farm field, which it originally was. And he walked around the farm field, and then he happened to encounter a man named Henry Woodman. And Henry Woodman was the farmer. His family owned that property when he was farming it. And they just, Washington, he just chatted for a bit. And Woodman said, "Oh yeah, I was here, I first came here because I served under General Washington at Valley Forge. I was here the whole time." And so they chatted a little bit more, and they would talk about farming techniques. And at one point, Washington said, "That's really interesting. I'm going to try that at my farm in Virginia when I get home." And that's when Woodman realized, "Oh my God, General, I'm so sorry. I didn't recognize you. I didn't know who you were. Here's his old commander-in-chief." And he said, "I'm so sorry." And Washington said, "No, of course not." they just went on chatting a little bit more about farming stuff, and then Woodman says, please, stay for dinner. And Washington says, well, I wish I could, but he gets on his horse, and he said, I have business to finish in Philadelphia. And off he goes by himself, back to Philadelphia, just the president. He had visited one last time, that place that had such a special bond for him. So I submit, and of course, if any of you have questions, I'll be glad to answer, but I submit that Valley Forge was so much more important to the American Revolution, to American history, to our history, than any of our social studies textbooks ever gave it credit for being. And so much else was going on. There's so many things, other surprises you'll find. Even when you get to the epilogue, there's fun little tidbits in there. Nathaniel Greene, a grateful state of Georgia, gave Nathaniel Greene like 200 acres for a farm. And after the Revolutionary War, he and his wife went down to farm those acres, and they hired a tutor for their children. And then when Nathaniel Greene died, his wife married the tutor. So they needed another tutor, and they hired a man named Eli Whitney, and while he was on their farm, he invented the cotton gin. There's little tidbits that are in there. I think one of the things I enjoy most, and that's the way I began my talk, is that how many people have found so many things surprising about the story and about Valley Forge. So I hope you will too. Thanks very much. Any questions? Let me know.
I have two.
All right, so the Costello.
No, I know that.
Okay.
Wasn't New York City considered the capital of the United States at one time? And my second question is, how were the orders, how did they communicate with each other? Was it somebody rode on horseback with a piece of paper? I mean,
You mean during the Valley Forge encampment? Well, to get to your first question, there was a time when New York was the capital. Philadelphia was during most of the American Revolution, because New York was mostly occupied territory during the American Revolution. The British occupied New York. After we formed a federal government, when Washington became president, New York spent some time as a capital. There was no Washington, D.C. at that time. I don't think it was until Adams was president that there was anything, any structure in Washington, D.C. So I think New York might have spent a little bit of time as the capital, but Philadelphia was mainly the capital at that time. And what would happen is that Washington would issue, I don't know if it was daily, but on a regular basis, general orders. And these would be dispensed to top officers, who would dispense these orders to his officers, to the next level of officers, and eventually down to the enlisted men. Has anyone ever been to Valley Forge? Okay. It's not very big. Especially if you're somebody who goes to American history sites, battle sites, you go to Gettysburg, how big that Gettysburg is. I mean, that's because you had a 3-day battle that took place over there. Valley Forge is a fairly small, enclosed perimeter. That's what made it more defensible. So it wasn't that hard to spread the word to troops. That was one of the reasons why there was some friction among the troops. There was a lot of reason for friction. But you had troops that were literally right on top of each other. So you could have a unit that was from Virginia or North Carolina with a unit from Massachusetts. And there was a lot of regional divisions. You had the issue. You had some of the southern units were very unhappy with the idea of black soldiers with guns. John Lawrence kept agitating to raise new companies or regiments of black soldiers to arm them to help fight the British. And the southern soldiers officers put their foot down, would not allow that. Because, possibly with justification, they feared you give black soldiers guns, they're going to use them on us before they use them on the British. So, yes, any other questions? Yes, sir.
I have 2 questions.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, I cheated by squeezing 2 surprises into one, so.
All right. So, I would want to know how many people died in Valley Forge, and what does an army eat when they're there in Valley Forge? And the other question I have, I heard that Martha showed up at Valley Forge and was there with him as much as any other woman who ever came to Battlefield.
Yeah, going back to what they ate, there were 2,000 soldiers died at Valley Forge, so 1 out of every 6 soldiers died at Valley Forge. What they ate was not much, because the supply system had totally broken down. Sorry about that. Let me get rid of these people. And I don't know how to turn this thing off. I don't know if it keeps coming back like Frankenstein.
There's a thing on the side. I have that.
No, I pressed that. Okay, I'm gonna press it and see if it works this time. All right. We'll see. Okay, we'll see what happens. There was corruption, there was the weather elements, wagons couldn't get through when the winter got worse. See, didn't work.
Say hello.
They had those problems with correspondence about the forge as well.
All right, let's see, we'll try it again. See what happens. Anyway, the supply system had broken down, so they weren't getting any food, or getting very, very little food. There was actually kind of food that was in the surrounding area. It wasn't like there was no food at all. But some of the farmers were like on the fence about what side they were supporting, so they weren't going to bring the food to the Continental Army. And the other thing too is some of the farmers were bringing their food to the British who could actually pay real money. See, the American Army had Continental scrip, which was worthless basically, because Congress had no way to raise money. So because of the breakdown, there was still no food, there was very little clothing getting there. So that's why literally some soldiers starved to death. There was no food and they couldn't get their food. You maybe shoot some game. There was a constant effort going on to forage the surrounding countryside. Martha was quite, when we talk about Martha, and as part of the book is dealing with her relationship with George Washington, they really were very devoted to each other. You know, there's a very, very strong bond between them. And yes, in the middle of February, she leaves Valley Forge, she leaves Mount Vernon, and makes her way in the depth of winter to join her husband at Valley Forge and to stay with him, which was an enormous emotional and psychological lift for him, because he was really battling despair and depression on a daily level. When his wife showed up, that was, for him personally, was a real turning point. There's a nice point, a moment in there, on February 22nd, 1778, Martha arranges, she gives a couple, whatever, shillings, a couple of things she has to 3 or 4 musicians who have very barest of instruments to come by and serenade General Washington with a couple of songs and wish him happy birthday. And it was the very first time that George Washington's birthday was publicly celebrated in the United States. And Martha arranged that. But she was there with some of the other women, and she stayed until the general said it's time for you to go home when the spring came. She spent, I can't say she spent every winter with him, but most of the winters while he was away with the Army, she spent at least some of them with him. So very remarkable. Yes, sir.
As you did your research, did you carve away storylines that you wish you had put into the story?
You know, one of the difficulties was that there were so many interesting storylines, we had to sort of condense some things. I mean, I happen to think that what was going on in Paris with Benjamin Franklin, trying to work out this deal with the French, was fascinating. I mean, you have to think about the achievement Franklin had. He persuaded the French government to back a revolutionary force that was trying to overthrow a monarch. You know, and Franklin was so charismatic that it never quite sunk in to King Louis until later on. It was way too late. That this was a bad idea. You know, rebellion against the king, not a good idea. Don't support it. It could go back to haunt you, which of course it did in the French Revolution. So I thought that storyline was fascinating to me. I wish we could have spent more time with that. I wish we could have spent more time with, at one point, Lafayette is dispatched by General Gates for the time he came closest to becoming a replacement for Washington. And then January, to go invade Canada. And that became such an embarrassment and such a bumbling series of errors that that could have been a whole book in itself. This Laurel and Hardy invasion of Canada led by this 20-year-old Marquis de Lafayette. The whole thing was invented to separate Lafayette and Washington, because Gates knew if he could drive a wedge between the two of them, Washington was weaker and more vulnerable. So there's a lot of things I wish we could have spent more time with, but as the book is like 460 pages or 420 pages as it is, and that's with not giving things as much space as we would hope to. Yes, sir.
I have a couple of things I have wanted to attention with you about. Before that,
Okay.
just to add to answering that gentleman's first question about what they eat.
Yeah.
Prior to them invading, prior to the Brits invading Philadelphia, they had foraged, and not foraged, kind of devastated the whole area north of Philadelphia, which was populated mostly by Quakers. So when they took Valley Forge, Washington side, 20 miles north of Philadelphia, is Valley Forge. It was a safe area both to keep an eye on the Brits in Philly, plus also the Brits had no interest in going over there anymore. They figured they destroyed it enough. So he could rely on both some Quakers who were against the war in general, but were also trading with the Brits, but were also giving some food to the Patriots. They also eat dogs. They ate whatever they could, whether it be hunting or roots or whatever. As far as Martha goes, Martha was probably the only person that George really trusted. He had his 3 aides-de-camps, as you mentioned
Yeah.
before, Lawrence, Hamilton, and
Lafayette, actually, Tex Chelman was
Lafayette.
another one, yeah.
But he didn't trust anybody. His savvy as far as a strategician was very much in question, particularly in Germantown. Your query on researching, there's so much on Washington. I think you did an excellent job of giving encapsulation of the importance of Valley Forge, and I do agree that it was a true battle, and it was a battle of survival, not just for the men to survive in the army itself, which had been devastated over the course of the year. Previously, the year before, it was down to less than 3,000 men on the docks on the banks of the Delaware until he crosses it to fight with the Hessians at Trenton and the Brits 3 days later at Princeton. But it was a battle of his survival.
Yeah.
Because as this is going on for 6 months, the capital did go to York. The state capital was at Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The new capital moved to York. And the guy who had all the papers that told about the government was a man named Thomas Paine. That's my point.
Yeah.
Close of contention with you in a minute. But he was the secretary, what we would consider to be secretary of Secretary of the Committee of Foreign Affairs. And he carried the papers of correspondence between Washington and York to let them know what's going on. In fact, it's really Thomas Paine, singularly, in Crisis 5, who omits Valley Forge, but has gone there several times. But he omits mentioning it in his crisis papers, if any of you are familiar with the crisis papers during the Revolution, which basically keeps the revolution going. But he omits it because he doesn't want to talk about the despair and the starvation and the problems of Valley Forge, so that the war
NPR.
But he was more than a propagandist, and he was maybe irascible, but that's all mine. But he was not just a course maker.
Right.
He was a stay maker. That's a little different. But he was the one who basically bolstered Washington because he gave him props. He kept on saying it's okay that he didn't win these battles. It was strategically good. It's strategically good that he stayed at Valley Forge and got his army together. It was the right thing to do. And it was not good to try to replace him with either Lee or Gates, 2 British, who ended up, Lee, as you mentioned in the Monmouth Courthouse, Lee gets captured at a tavern with a woman by the British. So he's out of running.
Right.
Very sure Gates will become a real abject failure, particularly down south later on in the war, where he retreats, runs away from his own men and the British, and then there goes his whole command. But it's really Thomas Paine. But just a couple of things I think you kind of felt was the importance of Thomas Paine in keeping Washington in battle. And the closest that him and Washington had together, particularly before on the march down to Delaware when they were retreating from Jersey and taking over Fort Washington, Fort Lee. But also the fact that he propped them up so that he realized, as you mentioned in the book, which is totally correct, you needed somebody there. And Washington was, by no doubt, a courageous, strong individual. He was shot 7 times at the battle on the courthouse. His jacket, but he never got hit.
Right.
It was amazing.
I just hate to interrupt this, but I know we have to end. And we had two more people who wanted quick questions.
Okay.
So could we do that and then have another conversation later in the meeting? All
Okay.
right, so the questions were,
Yes.
I have stupid questions. How did George Washington learn how to become a military person? Was there a school here in the United States? I mean,
could you repeat the
Oh, the question was, how did George Washington learn to become a military person? Was there a school here in the United States? Washington's experience was that when he was a younger man and there was the French and Indian War, he was able to raise a regiment of militia, Virginia militia, and basically he read books. There was no school. You know, this was before the West Point. There was a West Point. There was a West Point garrison during the Revolution, but not a West Point training camp for Army soldiers. So he read books about techniques and how to train infantry, how to train troops, and then he would put that into practice with this homegrown regiment of militia that he took into battle. He took into the Ohio Valley to face the French and especially their Indian allies. So his interesting question, because when the time came that the Americans had to choose a commander-in-chief, there wasn't a lot to go by because there were not a lot of prominent people who had military experience. You weren't going to make John Adams commander-in-chief or Patrick Henry. You weren't going to make Samuel Adams. You weren't going to make Thomas Paine commander-in-chief. George Washington had some military experience. He had faced battle situations before. So that's what was
He
made
also showed up in his uniform.
Yes, yeah, that some people have speculated that he was actually campaigning for the job because he showed up at the convention or that they had wearing a military uniform. So that's possible, you know, that it was, yeah, that he maybe he wanted the job. He may have had second thoughts about Valley Forge though. Yes.
It's probably a very complicated question to answer, but I'm just curious, in something like this, there's so much information available. How do you do research on a book like this? There's so many sources. How do you put it together to put something in order? I mean, I know this could take you hours to explain just the basic. I have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the bibliography of this book, there's a lot in there. You look between the bibliography and what we have called chapter notes at the end.
Yeah.
So, you know, zillions and zillions and zillions of books and articles that are cited. Basically, yeah, you have to have a cutoff point.
Yeah.
What we wanted to do is, as much as possible, draw from contemporaneous sources, meaning that we wanted to use as many sources as possible by people who actually had experienced what we're writing about. You know, there's any number of books that have been done in the last 100 years that may cover Valley Forge. You know, Ron Chernow has a chapter devoted to it in his massive biography of Washington. But we wanted as much as possible to have the authentic voices of the people. So, you know, you read all 1,500 of Washington's letters and memos and general orders that he generated while in Hamilton's hand during the Valley Forge encampment. There's 2 volumes of letters that Lafayette wrote during the Valley Forge encampment. There's a whole volume of John Lawrence correspondence, and there's journals and diaries kept by John Marshall, the future Chief Supreme Court Justice, James McHenry, who we know because they named a fort after him. The Star Spangled Banner was written while they were trying to blow that fort apart. The 5th President of the United States, James Monroe, was one of Washington's officers. So you do want to keep we wanted to keep as much as possible. Instead of casting too wide a net, let's try and get as authentic as possible. Now, very, very quickly, and we might have to end with this, but nobody asked me about John Lawrence. Why is the founding father we never knew? Lawrence, like I say, from South Carolina, he was 22 years old during Valley Forge. He kept aching for a battlefield command, and Washington wouldn't let him go. He was too indispensable. Washington, for the most part, kept John Lawrence by his side through the war at Yorktown. It was Lafayette's brother-in-law and John Lawrence who were chosen by Washington to accept Cornwallis' sword and surrender. Very valuable. But after Yorktown, things were at a low ebb in the war. Any of the fighting that was left was to the south. Washington finally said to Lawrence, okay, I'm going to let you go back to South Carolina and see if you want to raise or command a division or a regiment or whatever down there. And Lawrence did this. And in 1782, he finally got his command, and he always saw himself sword in the air, on a horse, leading a battle, charging against the British. And the day came, he had malaria, he was laying in bed for a couple of days, he gets word that this British force is advancing on Charleston, South Carolina. He gets his troops together, gets on his horse, gets to the field of battle, and there he is, living his dream, brandishing his sword, charging. He gets shot and killed right out of his saddle at the age of 27. His father buried him. He buried him on his farm in South Carolina, which is now a Trappist monastery. Because of Lawrence would have become Secretary of State, he would have become Senator Lawrence from South Carolina. He would have been part of the American government under Washington, maybe under Adams, under Jefferson, and one of the most important figures of American history. Today, unfortunately, because his dream came true, nobody knows who he is. So, anyway, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.